Hi, Peter from Mango, and welcome to Compliance Conversations.
For today's conversation, we've brought our partners together to hear what their insights into policies, what they should have, how to get the best value out of them, and determine whether they are being followed. And how do you determine if policy is working and that they are effective?
And I would start with the leadership level. A policy that's not effective is one that just sits on the wall, and there's been obvious evidence of changes in the business and the operational processes, perhaps change in some of the stakeholder or legal requirements, and 3 or 4 years down the track, the policy just is gathering dust and has never been reviewed. So I would start at the top. Is the policy actively looked at, not just to tick it off in a management review, but to understand its importance as a guiding document for our business? Here's what we're aiming for. If we take it in that context, then we should be revising it regularly. Is it still what we're aiming for? Not just what we put together for an audit 4 or 5 years ago. Really understand the importance of that document. I see lots of organisations not really understanding the importance of the policy. It's setting your direction. It is internally a commitment of what we're aiming for. It is externally a commitment of what we're aiming for as well. So hence it should be revised actively. That's the best technique to make sure it's current and effective within an organisation.
It really comes back to the previous discussion we had. You really need to turn each one of those policy statements into objectives and have KPIs against them to see whether they're effective, and the monitoring of them is quite important for the management team. Taking an example of quality policy, you have a statement on customer satisfaction, and then you need to turn that to a quality objective to say recording of customer complaints, recording of customer positive feedbacks, and then for in a lower level, have objectives on closure of customer complaint investigations within X number of days and so on. You really need to have that flow on traceability of how do we contribute to that one statement? What does that statement mean for us? And then how do we turn that into a KPI across our operation?
Look, a good policy should have some sort of objectives and broad measurement, so targets or those sorts of things built into it. So you can, and it does depend a bit on the policy, you can use some of those targets sometimes to measure. But if you don't have a nice convenient number or a nice convenient target built in, then you need to design your internal audit systems to reflect policy objectives and build good questions around your auditing to make sure that you can determine whether the policy is effective.
This is where the internal audit process comes into its own, because you will properly go and scrutinise the evidence and you'll look for fact-based information.
So in terms of effectiveness, I think first and foremost, I think you must consider your audience. An organisation that puts a policy in place simply just for the organisation is probably not going to be a very effective policy. In my opinion, I think it's important that you understand your audience, you understand the level and expectations of them, and you gain feedback from them if they believe the policy is working, if they believe it's doing its part. And of course, there is a level of effectiveness through an audit process as well that lets you see if the policy goes into specific details, then of course it's quite clear that you can observe and monitor and see how effective it is. But one of my pet hates is a policy document that's put in place and never changes. And often one of the things is it's there not for the company, it's there not for the employees, it's there because an external auditor expects to see it there. And that's one of my pet hates, is we have to create this documentation because an auditor needs to see it. Actually, the documentation should be much more about what the company needs from it, what's expected from the company, and to verify the effectiveness of it. I would say that with any documentation in a company, it's got to play a purpose, it's got to play a part, it's got to be effective in what it does, and therefore you've got to monitor and measure its effectiveness in some way, whether that be observation, audit, feedback, whatever it may be. That should gauge and allow you to identify, is this working?
One of my key issues, and I have to say this is one of my biggest bugbears with policies, is that it's such an essential document in gaining trust. One of the big things that I focus on in organizations is the organizational culture. Now, the biggest way for leadership
to erode that level of trust is to develop a policy that claims that we're going to bring about world peace and nuclear disarmament, and everything is basically incorporated into this policy, or they make all these commitments, and then when guys go out onto the site, what the policy leadership committed to and what's actually evident on site are worlds apart. I feel that a lot of policies are not effective as guys make these grandiose statements about what they're going to achieve, but when you go out onto the site, it looks like a war zone. So I think that for me is one of the biggest concerns around policies not being effective. And I feel that especially if the CEO puts his signature on a document, it erodes a significant level of trust, because this is a document that we talk to workers about constantly. It's in the policy, or check the policies on the notice board, and we make all these commitments and the CEO signs off on it. But when you go to the site, they're worlds apart. And that to me is the greatest eroder of trust, and where policies are not effective. Separate worlds from the policy and what's actually in life. Another way of determining whether a policy is effective or whether it's working is, and again, I go back to the ISO 45001 standard. One of the great requirements of there is they're always speaking about the intended outcomes of the management system. So they say, well, if you do this, you're going to achieve the intended outcomes of the management system. So specifically for 45,000, it's that you're improving your performance, you're achieving compliance, you're setting objectives, you're preventing injury and ill health. So those, in my mind, are the paradigms that you want to compare the policy against. So if we're having massive amounts of incidents and we're not complying and our performance is not there, then we're not achieving the intended outcomes. And to a greater or lesser extent, a lot of the commitments that we make within the policy are the intended outcomes of the management system. So we're going to prevent pollution and environmental degradation, and we're going to prevent food safety incidents, etc. Is that if we're achieving the performance, the intended outcomes of the management system, those align with the commitments that we made. And if we're not achieving the intended outcomes, then the policy commitments are worthless.
Taking up on your point in terms of how can you be sure that the policy is working effectively, well, the only way of determining that is actually to look at the outcomes of your system, whatever that looks like, against the policy requirements. So that requires, as you said earlier, the ongoing monitoring review of the outcomes and performance against the policy requirements. And that should involve a wide group of stakeholders at all levels within the business. Time and time again, you see policy statements that give a commitment to the communication and encouraging the participation of people within the business in their quality system or their safety system. But the people that actually at the lower levels in the business are never actually involved in determining or giving their input as to whether they actually feel involved and engaged. It's something that may be looked at the management review meeting, for example, and the top management of the business is sitting around a table as one of their agenda items and looking at, well, are we working towards, or are our efforts aligned with policy statements? And they'll all say, oh yeah, we're making good progress there, but in fact don't involve the people that are actually impacted on elements of that policy to determine that properly, because quite often that can be enlightening for top management where they think they're actually doing something, but the actual feedback and input from people at the lower levels in the business is something else.
Obviously you're looking for some objectives out of that policy to create a result. So you should be actually measuring somewhere along the line the output of what the policy is driving. So it's no good just having a policy without having some measurements behind it. So we're looking for some KPIs around the policy, whatever that might be. In quality, it's quite clearly driven by the objectives, which drive through to the KPIs. And you measure. You have to be able to measure what the policy is saying at the top. Otherwise, it's just words of wisdom and waffle that nobody can actually use effectively. There has to be a continuous improvement, there has to be measurable, and then you can test its effectiveness and feed it back. If the policy is not working, you'll soon find out.
To work out if it's effective is you need to go back and audit it. You need to go and look at what are the principles that it's trying to convey. You need to objectively look at what are the principles the business is actually walking and talking on a day-to-day basis and determine if they align. And if they don't align, you need to talk to the people involved in the business and the people that develop the policy and work out where that disconnect is and what needs to be re-established. Taking the time to actually do that 360-degree review on yourself and find out whether you're doing what you're saying you're doing, and whether that is clear enough throughout the business is the most important way to understand what's happening.
Thank you, partners, and hopefully to the people watching this, you got some value out of this. Of course, you can always go to our website, to the partner page at the bottom. You'll find the contact details of the people who participated. Thank you very much. Cheers.